David Cameron said, if you elect me, I will create a cancer drugs fund.
That's brilliant.
Yes and no. Cancer drugs fund is a very interesting example of policy. So while the English patients had every cancer medicine they wanted, people in Wales had none of the new cancer medicines that were coming through. We think of it as one system, but of course it's not one system. It's lots of general practices and lots of hospitals and lots of integrated care boards. Quantum computing is going to really fundamentally shift the way we can think about how medicines interact with the healthcare system.
Welcome to the Visionary Podcast, where we discuss science, medicine, physical health, and mental well-being. I read somewhere that sometimes a new treatment is allowed for a limited amount of time while doctors collect results from patients. Are we using this option enough?
I think there are lots of things we could do about clinical uncertainty. So we are exploring approaches. So typically you do clinical trials until you know a medicine is likely to be safe and effective, and then you roll it out to the whole population. That is what you typically do.
When researchers or scientists decide this medicine is potentially effective, what is the percentage here? Is this a safe, they're potentially effective or beneficial with minimum side effects? Are we thinking from 70% to 80% effective? Because at that point, there were some clinical trials, but it wasn't ruled yet to be used over the whole population. What is the percentage?
It really depends. It really depends. So if you've got, and this is causing some controversy within the Alzheimer's space at the moment, because we've got medicines that have shown that they slow progression of Alzheimer's down a relatively small amount. And there's a real discussion about whether it's enough to use the medicines at the moment. NICE says it isn't relative to how much they cost. And so it depends. It depends on how serious the disease is. It depends on how expensive the medicine is. It depends on a whole bunch of things. And that's why the regulators and NICE use the wisdom and judgment they do to be able to create frameworks, to be able to create processes that allow us to make those decisions from different medicines and different classes, where the effects will be bigger or smaller, where the risk of the disease will be greater or less. So yeah, the system I think does a very good job of that uncertainty. Where I think we could get much better, I believe, if I was in NICE or the regulator just now, one of the things I think we're much less good at is cost effectiveness. So quite often the regulators will provide a medicine a marketing authorization because it looks really effective in cancer, but it's had relatively few studies. Perhaps we've not got a trial which compared the new medicine to an old medicine. We've given the medicine to a group of people. It seems to work really, really well at shrinking the tumours. We know all the other treatments that we've got don't work at all well. And so the regulator says, right, in this instance, that's enough evidence for us to allow this to be sold to patients. They will insist on doing another trial to make sure that we've got data that compares it to another drug. And we'll do that in parallel. So they give a conditional marketing authorization so we can sell it, but at the same time, we've also got to do other trials to just make sure but the disease is so life-threatening that we want to get it out there as quickly as we can. The regulator's very good at that. The payer bodies so NICE, the people who are funding the medicines, we've been less good at that. We now use the Cancer Drugs Fund for that purpose. So if a medicine looks very effective, but it's tricky to work out exactly how cost-effective it is because we've got a relatively small evidence base, then the NHS, the healthcare system, will put it onto the Cancer Drugs Fund and will fund that medicine while the company completes more studies or collects more evidence in the real world setting. And so that's been really, really helpful. It's only in cancer. We set up an innovative medicines fund for non-cancer medicines 2 or 3 years ago, but very, very few medicines have gone through that. The last time I checked, none have. I think some might now. But we don't use, I don't think brilliantly collaborate with companies to say, right, okay, this looks really promising. I'm not quite sure how cost effective it is. Let's have an agreement where we really assess that within our healthcare system. I think there's much more we could do.
Yeah, the Cancer Fund, where does this money come from?
Cancer Drugs Fund is a very interesting example of policy.
Good policy?
Good policy, bad policy, all sorts of things. If you've got time, it might be interesting for me to give you a little bit of history on the Cancer Drugs Fund.
A snapshot would be lovely, thank you.
Because it's a really interesting example, I think, of some of the challenges. So the Cancer Drugs Fund was a bit of a reaction to a political challenge. So ahead of the 2010 general election, cancer drugs, people were really worried about them. NICE was saying no. The companies were saying, we can't afford to give you these medicines at such low prices. NICE was saying the prices are too high. Lots of medicines weren't getting through. Patients weren't getting access. So David Cameron said, if you elect me, I will create a cancer drugs fund. I will put £350 million aside and I'll use it to pay for cancer medicines. And he won the 2010 general election in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and he implemented a cancer drugs fund.
That's brilliant.
Well, yes and no. So this is one of these areas which I think is really interesting from a policy perspective. So there was no mechanism for how you would assess whether these medicines, now they'd had a license, so they were clinically effective, but the companies could charge whatever they wanted because they weren't going to be put through an assessment of their cost effectiveness. Oh. So the companies released these medicines onto the Cancer Drugs Fund, usually at a list price with no discount. And
surely there should someone be at the fund assessing this, right?
Well, yeah. So there was a new pot of money, but there was no process put in place for that.
It's just extreme. There is NICE looking at pennies.
So very, very interesting. So and not only that, each region was given a pot of money. So there were 10 regions. And so there was no consistency region by region to what was being spent. Because the money was being ring-fenced there, companies weren't getting NICE approval any longer because they were just going straight onto the Cancer Drugs Fund.
Okay.
Now, NICE makes decisions that cover England and Wales. The Cancer Drugs Fund covered England. So for this period of time, no new cancer medicines were ever made available in Wales because NICE wasn't saying yes to anything. So all the Welsh patients, while the English patients had every cancer medicine they wanted, people in Wales had none of the new cancer medicines that were coming through. So
we solved the problem by creating other problems.
So it was very interesting. We had a policy which seemed amazing. Let's pay for all cancer medicines, but had significant unintended consequences. And the Cancer Drugs Fund, I then was asked, a very smart guy called Peter Clark at NHS England was asked to centralise it and build a process for the Cancer Drugs Fund. And he did that. I was part of the committee which helped do that. So by 2015, I think we had quite a well-functioning Cancer Drugs Fund. And subsequent to that, because, again, it was spending money and it was slightly out of the NICE process, again, government was persuaded to tweak it again and bring Cancer Drugs Fund into NICE. So it became a pot of money available only for medicines that had gone through the NICE process and might be cost effective, and more data were needed to be captured.
So do you think there is more balance now?
So it's brilliant now. It's brilliant. I mean, it's a really great example, I think, of a terrible policy which had just not been thought through, which caused quite significant untold consequences initially, but where really smart people in our healthcare system and in our industry and lots of others and in government, as they realised there were challenges, to be fair, over a period of time, we didn't just abandon it. We said, right, okay,
let's fix it.
What's great about this? Yeah. What could it be? And over a period of time, it became what it is today, which is a fund for managing uncertainty and a way of accessing medicines earlier when the data might otherwise mean the company wouldn't accept the price. And I think that's really clever. I think it's a lovely bit of policy making, but also policy adjusting as you go, which I think is a really good example of innovation in the UK.
Hi, I'm Hala, your host today. If you're enjoying what you see, please hit that lovely subscribe button. It will mean a lot to us. or maybe a small podcast now, but with your support, we can build this channel together one step at a time. Thank you so much for being part of it. The MHRA, who are those people? What do they do? Are they enabling innovation in medicine or slowing innovation down?
The MHRA are our sovereign regulator, and I have no doubt, no hesitation in saying that the MHRA are really trying very hard. So they're a government body. They're civil servants, and they have been tasked by government with ensuring that medicines and other healthcare products that are released into the UK are safe and effective for human use. And so there's a balance. There's always a balance to be struck. But I think you now hear senior leaders at MHRA talking about risk proportionate regulation.
What does that mean, please?
That's where you may think very differently about the evidence you need for a medicine where someone's got a very serious end of life terminal disease versus something that's more for treating side effects of a more mild condition. The MHRA is really thinking just now about technology. We're starting to see incredible innovation coming through. So artificial intelligence being used to help guide treatment decisions, to help create medicines more effectively, to help build a better understanding of how a medicine's likely to behave in a patient. There's huge amounts of innovation happening. Quantum computing is going to really fundamentally shift the way we can think about how medicines interact with the healthcare system. It's going to really just speed up how quickly we can calculate. I'm not an expert on quantum computing, but it's really going to fundamentally shift how quickly we can calculate things and model things. So, and I think that's going to lead to faster, more efficient, clever drug discovery, but it will involve very different processes than we did in the past. So in the past, we gave medicines to animals to see what happened before we would give them to humans. We're trying to move away from giving medicines to animals because actually...
How are we going to test?
So I think we will build very complex system in using cells but also using computer models. And the regulator, the MHRA, is one of the regulators in the world which is right at the vanguard of how we think about regulating these new technologies. So no, I've been incredibly impressed by the MHRA. I think we're very, very lucky to have them. I think they keep our population safe, and I think they do a really brilliant job of pushing forward our medicines regulation, the way we think about innovating in the UK. I think we're very lucky to have them.
Okay, that's brilliant. But when we talk about new technology now, is the NHS ready to adopt these new technologies? We have AI, we have gene therapy, precision medicine. Are we ready with our very complicated or sophisticated, let's say, processes or bureaucracy?
Adopting really complex new technology at scale, I worry that population-wide, I worry that we're not. I think... And it's very interesting because we're now seeing a huge change in how the NHS is structured. So Labour have come into power. Wes Streeting, as the Health Secretary, has recognised there are some challenges within our health system. He's published a number of very important plans. So the 10-year plan for the NHS was published during the summer. And also the Life Sciences Sector Plan was written, which is what Labour are going to do to try and encourage the life sciences to invest and help us grow innovative companies within the UK. Those documents were written together by people who spoke to each other very regularly, so they are utterly consistent with one another. Are they ambitious enough? Are they driven enough? Is there enough detail? These are all things we can argue about, but there's a lot of work going on to think about the future of the healthcare system. But it's still, I think, largely focused on the big ticket items. So the three real strands are treatment to prevention. So we're moving towards preventing disease more than waiting till people have got disease and treat it. So that's a public health intervention. Hospital to local, or hospital to neighbourhood. I can't remember the exact expression, but...
And they are concerned about prevention mainly.
Well, I think it's one of the big strands. I mean, clearly we need to treat people with disease, but ideally in the healthcare system, you spend less money if you can stop people getting disease in the first place. So that's really important. and then analog to digital. But I think that final element and the question of adoption of really complex technology is going to be the thing that's going to be most difficult for the NHS. The NHS has a long track record of not being great at digital innovation. We think of it as one system, but of course it's not one system. It's lots of general practices and lots of hospitals and lots of integrated care boards, and they're all doing somewhat different things.
I've noticed.
So it's not like if you work for Pfizer and you decide you want to have a new email system, you just introduce a new email system.
Yeah, it's not as simple as
100,000
NHS.
people are forced to use it, right? That is that is how it works in a big corporate structure. The healthcare system doesn't work like that. It's not structured like that. We think of the NHS as a single thing, but it's not. It's lots and lots of different things.
Yes, when I first moved into this country 16 years ago, coming from Egypt, I assumed that this country is super, super high tech. And I was registered with my local surgery and everything. But there was a point, maybe 2 years later, when I had to go to the hospital for another check or procedure. And I immediately assumed that the hospital has all my medical record, my medications, my history, it's in the same city. But that wasn't true. I was asked what kind of health conditions, and I have a long list of that. And I had to, in a way, fill in the gaps, me as a patient with my failing memory, about medications and about conditions. And the lovely nurse was writing down, jotting down quickly. I was like, how primitive is that? And I was like, maybe the system could use a centralized data platform or something, so nothing would go wrong. I'm not trying to be critical, but so everything is clear and physicians are enlightened, and the time invested into collecting data again from patients, it's already there.
I agree completely. I mean, I think, and I think government understands this too. Making it happen is challenging. People worry about their data being discovered by other people, but there is a real push to really optimize what the NHS app is. So the NHS app really came into its own during COVID because everyone had to have it to show they had a COVID vaccine, or you couldn't travel anywhere. So people used it, and it became sort of part of the system. But I mean, that's the holy grail. The holy grail is that you have an NHS app on your phone. It has your clinical records in it so that you've got access to them. They're your records ultimately. And we've got, genetic data on there, and we've got all sorts of other data that people need. And then you've got a real opportunity, I think. So getting people involved in clinical trials is quite hard. Getting representative samples of patients into clinical trials is quite hard in the UK. I mean, we still are disproportionately white clinical trial participants. It's difficult to get participants.
Would that make a difference? I was reading about diversity, and of course I'm all about diversity, but it's the same. Oh no, not necessarily different genetics, right?
Yeah, you can see different types of populations having very different ways in which they process or handle different medicines. You definitely see that, and so I think it is really important that we understand how medicines work across a whole patient population. It doesn't mean they necessarily have to put patients into clinical trials. That is what people think about. We should have a representative sample of our communities in clinical trials. I'm actually more interested in just making sure that we've got ways of collecting the data afterwards. Real world evidence is really, really important. How do we ensure within our healthcare system that when we give someone a medicine, we've got a really good understanding of the effect it has in the real world. And then we can be sure, it becomes easier for us to be sure that there aren't unusual effects in subpopulations that we didn't see in the clinical trials because we didn't have enough of a sample. So that's really, really important, I think, as well. But the NHS app could be amazing because you could use it to find the right people for your clinical trials. You can use it to approach people directly and say, we're doing this study, we're looking for people exactly like you, with your history, with your genetics, with your disease, and you can find them, and people become, it's very clear that people who are involved in clinical trials do better people who go to hospitals which are active in clinical trials, even if they don't go into a trial themselves, do better than people who don't. And so
that's a brilliant solution, actually, because I was thinking, what are the logistics behind the clinical trials? How do we find patients or regular people who are willing to come or drive for a certain...
It's very, very hit and miss at the moment.
Yes.
At the moment, a company will say, right, I'm going to open this clinical trial in 10 hospitals, and the doctors in that hospital say, right, this trial is for these kind of patients, and they don't phone anyone up. They just wait for those kind of patients to come through the door. And if they do, great. And if they don't recruit anyone. And we have this huge problem with clinical trials that we spend a lot of money setting them up. And lots of the hospitals, lots of the trials don't recruit the right number of patients, don't recruit any patients sometimes.
Yeah, I recently took part in some survey blood. They only needed a blood test for me with a voucher in exchange of a voucher. Okay, but the nice thing is they were at booths. So all I had to do when I was there doing whatever to give blood, and it was super, super convenient for me.
Yeah.
And I got the voucher,
Yeah.
and they had their data.
And we're doing quite a lot of that with sort of population. There's a project called My Future Health that Sir John Bell is running. And
I think that was it.
And was that your and that's a lovely project. It's a really clever project. He's trying to collect information on a large number of people, and we will use that information for preventing disease, for working out how to better treat disease, for understanding population health. And the UK is uniquely placed to do this with a single... The NHS gives us a real advantage. Most other countries can't do this kind of thing. We've been talking about it for a long time. We've never really been able to take advantage. And I think that's what I really hope happens over the rest of this period of government. I hope we really embrace those new technologies, because at the moment, as the question you asked, are we ready to innovate in certain hospitals? I think we're very, very good in some hospitals, in some areas, of introducing new treatments, and even complicated new treatments, difficult new treatments.
What kind of areas? Privileged areas?
Not necessarily. So they tend to be large academic teaching hospitals. So Imperial, UCL, the Royal Marsden for cancer, the Christie Hospital in Manchester for cancer. These
where there are big universities.
Big universities, yeah, exactly. So, and those serve quite diverse patient populations. But if you live in the Lake District, then you don't necessarily have access to those big specialist hospitals, and you're more likely to get more of your treatment in the community or in your local hospital. And I think some of the new treatments, some of the really complicated, particularly for rare diseases. Rare disease tends to be treated quite centrally. If you've got very rare diseases, you typically see a small number of really specialist centres.
Yeah.
So people with rare diseases often have to travel quite far for their hospital care.
Is there a chance that there could be a certain kind of cooperation or partnership between specialised hospitals and local surgeries?
Wherever possible, I think we try and do that, but there are certain things that are more difficult to, if you've not got an expert, particularly if you give a treatment and there are side effects from it. Often you need to be near a specialist centre for that kind of management. So we do try and do that. But no, I think innovation in the NHS, I think it will always continue to be rolled out first in the major institutions, and then take a longer period of time to reach everyone. That's what I'd like to see become, and we'd see it even with not complicated. I think we talked earlier about medicines. Uptake of medicines is often very good in specialist centres and often much slower actually in other areas. Surgical techniques, even really complicated surgery, we roll it out very quickly in teaching hospitals, large teaching hospitals, big academic units. Very often the kind of surgery you get in smaller units may not have the same scope, the same opportunities, the same potential.